So welcome to the People's History talk that we're giving this morning, starting here in Davis Square. And we're delighted to see as many people here that want to learn about Somerville, going back a little bit of time, the last couple of decades or so. This is being sponsored by the City of Somerville, as well as the Somerville Museum. It will be videotaped, which is what you see here. So it will actually be on YouTube. So if you don't able to stay for the whole thing, or you have friends that have missed it, by all means you can watch it that way. So, I hope everybody will sign in and let us know that you were here, as well as how you heard about it. That helps us know. Take a handout as well, and if you're willing to wear a name tag so we get to know each other, that would be wonderful. So let me introduce the person that's going to be the guide today, the primary guide who's developed this tour. Mark McLaughlin. Mark is a native Somervillian, and he has some of his family members here who are still living very close by. And he will tell you a lot more about himself as the tour goes on today. So Mark?
Thank you, Brandon. Can everyone hear me?
Oh yeah.
All right. If I ask if you guys want to just walk over here to this lovely stone couple over here. All right. As Brandon said, my name is Mark. I'm born and raised in Somerville. So were both my parents, and so were both my grandparents. I'm fourth generation Somerville. My great-grandfather came here. He got a job on the Boston and Maine Railroad, and we've been here ever since. And that's actually not that uncommon, or at least wasn't, as the city's changed a lot. But the community I grew up in was a lot of people like my family, multi-generation immigrant families that settled here and never left. The reason we start this tour in the Davis Square is because Davis Square is really the heart of the change in the city and where a lot of the change has happened. In fact, I personally believe it's probably the city, Somerville, is probably one of the most changed areas in the Boston area. And I grew up in possibly a very fascinating, in my opinion, era, because I think it was one of the biggest eras of change in this city since the Industrial Revolution. So at one time, Davis Square and a lot of the other squares, so Somerville obviously has dozens of squares. We have Davis Square, Teal Square, Magoon Square, Ball Square, Inman Square, Somerville, Cambridge. We're also very close to Porter Square, Harvard Square. And the squares, as the city's developed, and we'll talk about the city's development at our other stops, the squares really marked the center of neighborhood life. As you had these immigrants coming in, they were basically the downtown districts, where today you see lots of fancy restaurants and dining and going out for drinks. At one time, this is where you went and got your essentials. This is where you went to the grocery store. They had a lot of department stores. And it basically made it so you never really needed to leave your own community. So you had these immigrants coming here, living here for generations, forging these tight-knit communities. And they became very insular communities in many ways because you never really had to leave. My grandmother was over here. She would say that when she was growing up, going into downtown Boston was a big ordeal. And you would get dressed in your Sunday's best just to go into downtown. But if you were really just doing your essential shopping, you would come into the square. But at some point, the squares started to die. Really, when they started to come up with the mini malls and super stop and shop and all these things, we started to see the squares fall into decline. And we'll talk more about the decline of the city later on. So when I was growing up, a lot of this stuff wasn't here, right? I grew up in an era in the very beginnings of the changing stages. And that change really started to happen when the Red Line across the street got extended into Davis Square in 1984. That was going to be the first start of what we started to see, the revitalization of the city. And this spurred what I call phase one gentrification. So prior to this, as I mentioned, you had these tight-knit communities. People have lived here for generations. The first community that really started moving in here in the late 80s and early 90s was the artist community. And the artists started coming here because it was cheaper than Boston. It was cheaper than Cambridge. They started coming in and they started making a little scene for themselves. Some people calling them urban pioneers or almost like prospectors. You could come here and snatch up the houses. They were very cheap. Rent was very affordable. But Somerville was a tight-knit place and sometimes leery of outsiders. And some people saw the writing on the wall that the city was beginning to change. So a movement became underfoot in the late 80s and early 90s called No Barneys in Somerville. I don't know if does anyone know the term Barney? So Barney was a local term, a local specific Somerville slang that basically meant you're not from here. This is what Somerville people referred to as outsiders. So there's a movement came in the 80s that said no Barneys in Somerville. And they printed t-shirts and bumper stickers and hats. If you look at your pamphlets, there's actually a photo of some Somerville folks wearing their No Barneys gear. And while it was mostly humorous and made to kind of poke fun at outsiders, there was actually some undercurrent of real resentment. And the reason I talk about this here at this statue, and there's several of these statues around the square, they've moved them since, but there's some over there. This is one of the first art projects that was sponsored by the city as the Red Line came in. And they called this Statue Park. And an artist came and made statues of local residents. And this couple actually owned a fish shop here in the square. So these were actually modeled after real residents. And people notice that they have these bronze masks. And a lot of people will say, well, what's the artistic vision here? What are these masks trying to convey? Is there a metaphor going on here? But the reality is, these aren't their original faces. When they put the statues in, and as a sign of kind of local resentment towards the artists and the new artist community moving in, there was a bit of hostility. And some local teenagers in the middle of the night came here and smashed all the faces off the statues with hammers. And then they replaced them with these bronze masks so that couldn't happen again. And that's going to kind of be a little bit of a theme as we go on this tour, kind of the old versus the new, and people struggling to navigate a changing landscape. So that was in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Then in the early 90s, Cambridge got rid of rent control. And this sends a second wave of people leaving Cambridge for cheaper rent. And we start seeing more people move in. But there's a slow change up until this point, so it's a slow turnover. But then, of course, as many of you probably know, in early 2000, we had the housing market boom. And the rent and home prices skyrocketed. My grandmother bought the house that I grew up in for $10,000 in the 1950s. Today, most of the homes you'll see in this tour are worth over $1 million. So that was a rapid, accelerated change. So the square has changed quite a bit. It's kind of been the heart of the change, and it's kind of started here, and it's rippled throughout the city as the Red Line got extended. Now, obviously, we have the Green Line, and there's a lot more to talk about. Really quickly, I have my local historian, my expert, my mother. This is where I get all my information from. I've never read a book. But I'll just ask my mother really quickly, because she grew up in the square. Now, when I was growing up, my mother told me, don't go down to Davis Square. It was kind of shady. I believe former city councilor Jack Connolly said it was nothing but wise guys and winos at one time. But Mom, if you could really quickly, because she likes to tell me where all the old shops was, if you mind telling us what Mike's Pizza used to be. Do you remember? That was the Waldorf. That was a department store. CVS was Park Snow, another department store. Starbucks was Woolworths. So a lot of department stores where people came down and did their shopping. And as I said, the malls came and the squares kind of died out a bit. And then we started to see more restaurants and shops come in. Some of the first ones that came that really started to change things was Red Bones in the Burren. what Mr. Crates is right now was the Someday Cafe, and this was again, that was a drugstore before it was the Someday Cafe. And again, we started to see that phase and the multiple phases of gentrification. Now, when I was growing up, a lot of these stores were kind of, not much was going on. The historic Somerville Theater, which today has hosted acts from U2 and has had lines around the blocks now. That was basically under construction, boarded up. They reopened it in the 90s. So there wasn't a lot going on. And you can see now, if you come here at nighttime, the place is buzzing. So I'll talk more about the transition as we go on. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I was waving to a friend.
Oh, I'm sorry. But if you do have any questions, please let me know. Does anyone have any questions? All right, if you could just follow me. We have a large group, so just be mindful of pedestrians and traffic. You know, we are going to be walking through residential communities, so just try to be mindful and respectful of our neighbors. So just really quickly, draw your attention to 48 Grove Street over here. We'll talk a lot about Somerville's industrial past. This city, which is the original this building, which is the original building, used to be a frozen food manufacturer. And now today it's kind of the host of law offices and tech companies. And that's going to be a very common theme as I talk about the transition from our industrial past to where we are today. What was I going to say? I'll finish up at our next job. I just wanted to point this out, and I'll point some more things out on our walk.
I would also just like to add, as city planner with the city of Somerville for several decades, that this was kind of one of the first buildings that actually got adaptively reused to another type of use, which is very exciting because at one point, when I first started working in Somerville, old buildings were considered obsolete. Let's get rid of them, tear them down, demolish them. There's no value. And that's gradually been changing, very fortunately. But this was one of the first buildings that actually did get converted, and very nicely done as well.
And I'll just point out as well, when I talked about, you know, Somerville being the transition, and with the red line coming in, it was kind of a diamond in the rough because we're actually closer to downtown Boston than most parts of Boston. And we're closer to Harvard Square than some parts of Cambridge. So it just became, once the red line got extension and it was able to have easy access to downtown and people could afford to live here, people that work downtown could jump on the train and zip right into Boston and Cambridge. That really, you know, sped up the changes. So as we talk about Somerville's industrial past, and I'll get more into it, I love this bike trail because it really symbolizes the changes of the city. Because this bike trail, and you can look in your pamphlet, there should be a photo, used to be train tracks. And you had these freight trains and things that ran through. And as we pointed out, one of the factories here, well, there were many factories in Somerville. This building right here, which today is Artist, I believe it's like an artist co-op loft building. This used to be a soap factory. That building right there and the one next to it used to be an ink factory, which blew up in the 90s. It was a big giant fire. I was there.
I remember.
Yeah, there was a big fire. This building here is not the original structure. This was a casket company. And this building here was a wood frame door manufacturer. And today, I believe, is a audio recording and sound engineering building. So just here, on this single spot, we have half a dozen industries, right? And exactly, and this is just right here. Imagine that spread out and multiplied throughout the city. And we would have the train lines running through, rumbling through the city. So you can see that the industrial past. Now, when I was growing up, these were abandoned train tracks and mostly abandoned factories. So I grew up playing down here. We called it the jungle because it was all overgrown, and we'd make rafts in the overflowing water when it rained and hunt for snakes. That's what we did. And now you see it's returned and revitalized as a bike trail, and these factories have been revitalized into businesses or condominiums. And you can kind of see it's kind of symbolic of the changes in the city.
Yeah, again, to add on to this, by the way, my name is Brandon Wilson, and I have been a city planner in Somerville since 1980. So I've witnessed a lot of these changes, and I'm very pleased that a lot of them have occurred. But one of the reasons for doing this tour is so that people have an appreciation for Somerville as of today, that it wasn't always like this. So as an example, I'm going to just point out that this bike path was something that we worked on in the 1980s. And when that was happening, there was a lot of opposition from the homeowners along here and people that lived here. They had wanted nothing to do with this. They thought this was going to be a getaway for the riffraff that was going to come in from other communities in Boston and such and rob the people there and take off again. And so we had quite a lot of trouble actually getting this bike path to happen. Now, if you were to live along here and you wanted to sell your property, it's probably worth another 10 grand to do that. So it just goes to show you how things have really changed in the city, and in this case, for the better.
Yes.
The community that was here before the Red Line, where was everyone from originally?
I'll talk about that in a minute. And also, to add on to what Brandon said, and there was a period, a brief period, where when the bike path was built, that again my mother would say, "Don't walk down the bike trail at night." They hadn't beaten back all the trees yet.
Yeah.
They didn't put in the street lights, and there was a period even when they did put those in that they were getting broken.
Yeah, exactly.
So it kind of was a great place to get robbed, but that changed. I'll talk more about some of the folks that lived here and how the community was built around these factories.
And just as evidence of that, at the time when we did put the bike path in, there were fences all along the way. Chain link fences, wood fence, anything they could think of to deter people from coming in their yards. Today is Porch Fest, I think you all know. So you will see that those fences are not only down, but the spillover from those houses onto the bike path it's just like an open book over there. And so now people have gates on these fences so that they can access the bike path themselves and have a getaway onto getting onto the T or wherever they're going. So again, another physical change you'll see along here.
So I'll explain using this lovely mural here. And I don't know if do you know anything about the artist? I don't. But
She's
so I love this map. I just like to use it to get the lay of the land, right? So historically, Somerville was originally settled as part of Charlestown, and it was referred to as Charlestown beyond the Neck. And if you look in the map, this is Charlestown over here, which is kind of a peninsula going into Boston. And there's an area of Charlestown just beyond Sullivan Square that's referred to this day as the Neck, Charlestown, the Neck. And Somerville was referred to as beyond the Neck. And of course, back then, it was all just forests, and as the settlers came, the first they had the first governor of Massachusetts, Governor John Winthrop, had a farm here in the Ten Hills neighborhood. It was the Ten Hills Farm, and it was purchased from the Pawtucket Indians. And it was for a long time, obviously, it was just a rural community. Somerville also played an important role in the American Revolution. In the Powder House, if you've all been to the Powder House Monument, there was an old mill that still stands today, where the British soldiers came and confiscated gunpowder. That was a incident that led to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which kind of kickstarted the American Revolution. One of the first acts of aggression happened right here in Somerville. Also, in Prospect Hill, George Washington raised the first American flag in the city, and we also had Paul Revere ride through Somerville. The British coming right down Broadway. So a lot of history here. Moving forward, after the American Revolution, Somerville remains for a very long time a rural pastoral land, mostly farmland. As Charlestown, as we know it today, starts to develop and become more urban, Somerville remains rural, and the residents of Beyond the Neck were becoming frustrated by their tax dollars mostly going into kind of the urban center of Charlestown, well, mostly out here in Beyond the Neck. they didn't have paved roads, they didn't have school buildings and things like that. So in 1842, they decided to separate themselves and become the independent town of Somerville. The name, as far as we know, is just a fanciful name, they said. There's no John Somerville or anything like that I'm aware of. But it remains a kind of a rural place. In fact, some of the wealthy Bostonians, known as the Boston Brahmin, would come here and they would have their summer homes here. This was a place that they come and get out of the city, the congested city, and they'd cross the Charles River, and they'd have nice views of the city with all our rolling hills. And some of those, more Victorian type big houses were built at that time on many of our historic homes. But something happens very quickly around the same time, Somerville is becoming an independent town. In this general time, between these decades, we have the Industrial Revolution. What's up here? We have the Industrial Revolution happening, and which the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in the United States is in Lowell, Massachusetts, just a few miles north. And Somerville becomes a great place to set up industry. And as if you look at the map, we're on the banks of the Mystic River. We're about 2 miles north of the Charles River, and we're about 2 miles inland from the Boston Harbor. So it's a great place to set up industry. And the first thing they start doing is they start laying down these railroad tracks. And they start building these factories. Coinciding with this is, to answer your question, this was also happening around the same time as the Irish potato famine. And this is the first time in the United States history we have a mass wave of immigration. And Boston becomes a big place to come. So we're having mass immigration, rapid industrialization, and by 1872, Somerville goes from the town of Somerville and becomes the city of Somerville as the population begins to explode. The Italians, the Greek, the Portuguese, and many more French Canadians. So shout out to my grandmother. Got an Irish French Canadian mix. French Canadians aren't mentioned nearly enough, but they actually have, Somerville and North Cambridge also have a very strong French Canadian community. So we start seeing this rapid industrialization, and things start changing very quickly, and we go from becoming this small rural community and in just a few decades' time becoming a huge industrial hub, and so much so that at Somerville's industrial peak we become the most densely populated city in the country with over 100,000 people in just 4 square miles. I'll point out as well, Assembly Square gets its name, which now Assembly Row, some people call it. Assembly Square gets its name from, there was a Ford plant there, and they used to assemble cars. So that's where that gets its name. When I was growing up, the plant was long gone, and this was one of the many strip malls they attempted to make. It was kind of a fledgling place, and we actually had one of the highest stolen car rates in the country down Assembly Square. And so I always say we went from making cars to taking cars. But a lot of that industrial, I'll talk about the various immigrant groups at one of our next stops. All these people are coming here. We're packed to the brim. Where are we going to put all these people? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, I have you all here today talking about the history. This is a reminder, this is the 250th anniversary of our nation, the founding of our nation, and it started this last fall with the Boston Tea Party reenactment. So this is the year, 2024, that Somerville is celebrating its history, because as Mark just mentioned, this was the raid on the Powder House, it was known as, on September 1st, 1774. So we will be celebrating this year on September 1st, a Sunday of Labor Day weekend. So you need to put it on your calendar now to stick around, because we'll be doing a reenactment with the British and reenactors coming from Boston to raid this Powder House once again. So put it on your calendars right now. But we are very much a historical community, and one of the things that I've worked really hard over the last couple of decades is to try and remind everybody that Somerville has as much claim to history as Boston and Cambridge and Lexington and Concord, and because it all started here, as Mark said, this was the spark that started the American Revolution. And we also have, as he already mentioned, the flag raising on January 1st. when George Washington himself commanded the flag went up. So take that and tell your neighbors as well.
It comes back every year.
Every year we celebrate that as well. And we also have Patriots Day, which we just had over at Foss Park, which is, as Mark mentioned, Paul Revere came riding by, and he stops in Somerville nowadays every time. It's one of his favorite places. Yes.
What year did George Washington raise the flag here?
I'm sorry, what about Jordan?
Where did George, where did he raise
Where?
it?
Oh, I'm sorry, on Prospect Hill?
What year?
What year?
George Washington, what year raised that flag?
He did that in 1775, so it's next year we'll be doing that one. Okay? Yes. Good. So put that on your calendar too. Yes.
Was there political turmoil from the fact that Somerville people wanted to secede from Charlestown? Charlestown was going to lose tax base. They were going to lose income. Did they just let the people go? What kind of deal was made to let that happen?
I think it was just, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it was just kind of put to a vote and that they were able to leave.
Put to a vote within Charlestown too?
I'm not exactly sure, to be honest. But, no, it's okay. That's a great question. I'll have to look into that. I just know we want it out. All right, I'll just walk up here. I'll stop at the corner up here.
And just to say about the artist, somebody asked about this here. This is I believe, at one point a local artist, and this has been commissioned and recommissioned several times by the real estate agent here, Thalia Tringo, because it did get damaged at one point, but she very much believes it's an important part of our city, so we thank her for doing that. It's a wonderful way to talk about all the neighborhoods.
Yes, exactly. I just took advantage of her artwork. And then, real quick, too, you mentioned this real estate company and these condominiums. At one time, this was Kylie Fence. They did that chain link fences.
Yeah.
So just really quickly, again, as we just walk through, I just want to point out this building right here behind you today is an architecture firm. When my mother was growing up, this was cedar asphalt. When I was growing up, those nice plate glass windows were filled with cinder blocks. And it was nothing. This condominium building over here, this used to be an auto body shop. And I always love to point out, one of our mainstays in the community is Why Not Variety. People might not know, Why Not is Tony spelled backwards. And Tony was the original owner. A little bummed because it just replaced it, very recently replaced the sign, which had like a not a lot of nostalgia, but I guess, maybe it's a update.
Just about real estate prices, in case people are wondering, I don't know how many here actually live in Somerville or bought property and such, but the real estate prices here, as Mark has already indicated, has really jumped. One of the many jobs I've had as a city planner with the city of Somerville was reusing old school buildings back in the 1980s. And we had a couple developers that wanted to convert them into condominiums. We're not going to go by it today, but there's one right down the street from here, the Low Street School, that was turned into it. And so the developers went off to get financing to install these condos in these old classrooms, which was a perfect adaptation. But they actually had trouble getting financing because, amazingly, some of these developers wanted to sell a condo for $100,000, and they were like, the banks, no way, who is going to purchase that in Somerville, or Slummerville it was known. So I actually, as a planner, said, this is crazy, I'm going to start tracking real estate and showing how the values are really going up. This was in the early 1980s, and I had red dots on the map for any time it went over $100,000. That map today, you couldn't buy the garage for that amount of money. So just to give you a perspective on how things have changed that way.
We'll just keep going around the corner here to Morrison Ave. So as we mentioned, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, population explosion. Now if we rewind the clock to around the turn of the century, Boston was originally settled on what was called the Shawmut Peninsula. It's a very narrow strip of land. A lot of Boston today is built on landfill. Actually, landfill that they got from Somerville when they mowed down some of the hills and filled in the back bay with the land they got from the Cobble Hill area. If you know, Cobble Hill is no longer a hill. But if you look at the time back then, when you get these neighborhoods, if you look at the map of Boston, it's a little confusing, especially if you're not from here, right? We have the North End, which is not the most northern neighborhood. The South End and South Boston are not the most southern points of the city. We have East Boston, which is across the harbor, right? It's a little confusing. But a lot of that, we have West Roxbury and Roxbury that aren't connected and separated by Jamaica Plain. So it's a little confusing. And the reason for that is the time that these areas, at one time, they were all independent towns and cities. And downtown Boston was, or the city of Boston, consisted of the North End to the South End. And you have, if you look at the housing stock in those places, what you see in the North and the South End are largely tenement row housing, the brick structures that are much more common in places like New York and Philadelphia and other cities across the country. You have these old style housing. Places like Dorchester and Roxbury and Somerville and Cambridge at those times, as we mentioned, were mostly rural. But as these factories started popping up and these immigrants started coming here, we needed a place to house them. So enter New England's staple home, the triple-decker. Now the triple-decker was basically designed as a form of tenement housing. What they did is they took the structure of the row house and they chopped it up. And they separated them. And at those times where you had these densely packed neighborhood slums like the North End and the South End at the time, you had disease and cholera and things like that. So when the triple-decker was designed essentially as a tenement, but with the separation of the houses allowed for sunlight and natural airflow. So they had these houses, and as people were leaving these neighborhoods into these new burgeoning the suburbs at the time, they became known as streetcar suburbs. So you had downtown Boston, and you had the streetcar suburbs, places like Somerville and Dorchester and Roxbury, because they had the trolley lines that would run into the city. And they were this new, not the suburbs as we know them today. Somerville was considered a suburban community outside of Boston, and these houses, just like the bike trail, symbolized kind of the rise and fall of the community. Because when they built them, this was looked at as a gateway to the middle class for people. These are immigrants fleeing famine and war, and they're coming here and they're able to leave the slums of the North End, and now they have a house, and they have a backyard and there's space, and they have their factory job, and they're planting their roots here. And they planted their roots here, and they sometimes whole families would be in these houses. Just like I grew up in the same house my mother grew up in, and you pass them down, and kind of this is when you start to see the forging of the community that we know today, or knew, I should say. The community that I grew up in was kind of the vestiges of that era, of people coming here and taking a lot of pride in being, this was the American dream for people. Now that's, of course, is a rosy picture, right? These factory jobs were not glamorous, life was hard, but it was the idea of what it represented. It was upward mobility, right? These were blue-collar people working hard factory jobs, but they were planting their flag in America and able to make a life for themselves. So we wonder, how did this population become so dense, right? Well, when you have a triple-decker, it was very common. My father grew up in a triple-decker. There was 8 kids in their family. That was very common, sometimes more. Sometimes you see, we talk about Somerville is a very diverse community, always has been, but many of our diverse communities were largely Catholic. The Irish, the Italian, the Portuguese, a lot of Catholicism. So there was a lot of kids. The Irish were known for having many children. So if you had, like my father's family, 8 kids, let's presume you have 2 parents, it's 10 people on one floor. You multiply that by the same on each floor, that's 30 people in one house. And if you have a street with hundreds of houses on it, you could have 1,000 people on one street in the city. So you can see how dense it became. But just like the bike trail, as things started to change, we reach our industrial peak, and a couple things start happening. One, the interstate highway is starting to be built. The suburbs as we know them today, this is after World War II, the suburbs as we know them today are starting to be built. And many soldiers, and Somerville has a strong history of service in the military. Many people served in World War II, and they came back and they had the GI Bill. And with the GI Bill, was afforded people was low interest loans so they could purchase these new burgeoning suburban homes. People started leaving the city as they were seeking new opportunities in the suburbs. At the same time, we started to see industrial decline, where many factories started also going out to the suburbs or going overseas or changing their locations. And Somerville became to fall into decline. And so much so that it locally became known as Slummerville. And it became develop a reputation for crime, which I'll talk more about at one of our other stops. And the triple decker, which once was viewed as a symbol of getting out of the slum, became known as slum tenements themselves. And they were known and associated with crowded, cramped, immigrant communities, poor people, so much so that many of these new suburban communities stopped zoning for them. They were associated with being slum tenements, which was ironic because they were built as an alternative to slum tenements. So a lot of communities, as you see, even if you move through the city, if you start in East Somerville, you see a lot more density. As you move west, even through Somerville, the houses spread out just a little bit more. If you go into West Somerville, and then you go into East Arlington, you slowly start seeing the houses get a little more space, and you start seeing more single-family homes. And that's kind of, you can see this kind of westward expansion as some of the triple deckers and the more multi-family homes start disappearing. And we start seeing the suburbs as we know them today. And then, just like the bike trail, the irony never stops that now today, these houses have been revitalized and restored, and people started snatching them up back when you could probably give them away. And now many of these homes are well over $1 million. Even the condominiums, they chop them up, each floor into a condominium, and you could sell those for, actually, I have family friends that grew up in Davis Square. They sold their house for, I think, $1.5 million. They renovated it and then sold each floor for that same price. So that's very common. Do you have anything to add, Brenda?
Yeah. Also very true. At one point, as Mark said, they were actually banning three-family houses from being constructed in the city of Somerville. So I would like to make this an opportunity to introduce somebody that was responsible for changing that zoning recently, which is I call him an alderman, but he's really now a city councilor for Ward 1, whose name is Matthew McLaughlin. Which is, if it looks like there's some connection there, there is. They're brothers. So, Matt, do you want to put your hand up? He's here with his son today as well. So we have some more of the McLaughlin family here. But the zoning has recently changed, and now we're promoting three-family housing in many parts of the city because it is a very useful housing type. When it was actually a real three-decker, which, as Mark said, was the sort of the opportunity for home ownership. The beauty of it was you could buy the house, you could live on the one floor, often the first floor if it was a larger upstairs, and then you rented out the other two, and that helped you finance the purchase of that house. So it was a very beautiful way to make home ownership available. Just one other point I want to make, just talk about the density that Mark just said, is this building right here behind you, the blue slate building, used to be, when we first bought in this neighborhood, that was a one-story automotive garage. Now it has 10 condominium units. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what's not the case. Matt, you want to come up here and say a few words? Please. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm Mark's brother, Matt. I'm the handsome McLaughlin. He's the brains of the operation. But yeah, I just want to speak real quick on that because this past year, so I didn't expect to speak, but I'm very proud of what we did. One thing, Mark, I don't think you mentioned is that the triple decker was created by our French-Canadian ancestors who came down from Nova Scotia and Quebec and all these areas, and it's called a three-decker or a triple-decker because it's modeled after a three-decker boat. So they were boat builders who came down to the United States, and it's really a regionally unique structure. So we had a thing passed called the MBTA Communities Act, which basically requires communities to build dense housing around transit lines. And we were trying to figure out how to become in compliance with this, even though we're already a very dense city. And one of the things on the table was, let's just allow the triple decker citywide. So what happened, as Mark mentioned, is a lot of the development, when the triple decker became seen as a blight, cities zoned it away. So they basically said you're not allowed to build a triple decker in cities that there's hundreds of thousands of triple deckers. So it really was just counterproductive and just backlash against working class communities. So when this bill came up, one of the things I proposed was allow the triple decker to be made citywide, and that's what we have now. So I was just saying that, yeah.
There's a beer pong.
Knew some of them. Yeah, just very proud of that fact, and I hope other cities do it, because you see around the country people trying to get rid of 1-2 family house zoning, which is exclusive and doesn't allow the dense housing that needs to be built. So we really killed two birds with one stone. We addressed housing density and revitalized an important structure that's important to the community. Thank you.
I'll also point out another housing style across the street, very common in the city, is the two-family home. These are Philadelphias. Hello. Yeah, I grew up in a two-family structure like this. These are known as Philadelphias, very common. And you can kind of see, if you walk through the city, its history of transformation, when you'll sometimes see this big, beautiful kind of Victorian mansion, and then triple and two-family structures crammed in all around it. So you can see that a lot of time those houses, those bigger structures, predate the more multi-family units that were here. So those might have been maybe the homes of kind of affluent residents that were coming here to summer, and they were sometimes leaders of commerce in the community. And then as the industry came in, they kind of built these. Sometimes they would sell off parcels of their lands or their farm, and they started building up these multi-family units row by row.
Just to clarify that, when he referred to a Philadelphia-style house, two-family, what that means is there's often a hidden bedroom, they call it, which is on the second floor, which gives the versatility that if you live on the first floor and you want to have an extra bedroom, you just use the stairway to go up to it. But if you also are on the second or third floor, you can actually incorporate that into your unit on the second floor. That's a Philadelphia style. All these houses around here that are two-family houses are not all Philadelphia style. Many of them are just more the classic ones, but that's what that means and as such. And all of these houses, just as a point of historical information, were typically built in the late 1800s into the turn of the century, 1900s. So you're looking at older houses, many of which have been fixed up, renovated, as we said, turned into condos in many cases. And just to say something a little bit about that, because that's really changing the character of our community, the condominiums. We had a condominium conversion ordinance in the city of Somerville in the 1980s, and as Mark mentioned, rent control was thrown out in Cambridge, and as part of that, the underpinning of the condominium conversion ordinances that restricted them was thrown out as well. So we lost that ability to control them, and that's when a lot of these houses, the 2 and 3 families, were converted to condos, which means that they're for ownership, which is good if you can't afford to buy the whole house. But on the other hand, it means that you've lost the versatility of raising a family and starting on the first floor and moving upstairs as you have more income, which was the beauty of these 2 and 3 family houses.
So just really quickly, I'd like to point out, if you look at your pamphlet, these houses here, which I believe were built in the 80s, this used to be a corner store over here. But more importantly, one of the few factories that was still up and running when I was growing up. This home right here used to be Russ's Donuts. And Russ's Donuts was a donut factory, and you used to see the box trucks lined up here, and they would make the donuts here and ship them out to various stores. But the neighborhood secret was, it was this brick cinder block building, no signage or anything like that, but they used to sell the donuts off the rack for $0.25. And they were the best donuts I've ever had. I know everyone's about Davis Square Donuts, or nothing beats Russ's Donuts, and nothing beats $0.25. So it was great growing up in the city. I always sound like I grew up in the 50s, because I'm like, I could leave my house with $1 and I could get a donut, and I could go to Wynot's and they had teenies. I don't know if you guys did little sugar drinks, and you could get a bag of chips, and all this was for under $1. So that was one of the few places that was factories that was still up and running. It was a lot of on Halloween they would give the donuts out for free. I don't know. I think a lot of the factory workers were just kind of taking, selling them off and putting the change in their pockets for a little extra. But it was definitely a neighborhood staple. The structure ended up having, I think the roof collapsed in early 2000, and they ended up relocating. But yeah, we miss Russ's Donuts.
Okay, I have to add on here, just so to be clear, they are not talking about this house right here. We're talking about, we went by it, which is it's actually like 3 storefronts. No, actually, it was a little further down.
It was definitely this.
Okay, but what I was going to point out is that the Russ's Donuts was here, but as you go the next thing down there, which was actually a cleaners as well as other commercial uses and such. And so again, looking back at how we tried to change the thinking about older buildings, and we didn't let them demolish it. So somebody bought the building there, and when you walk by, you might have noticed there's a courtyard in there, which is where they actually have parking and such. So they took down the center of the building of the commercial stores that were there, and now we have 2 condominiums, one on either side of that as well. And so again, an example of small stores, manufacturing, or I guess you want to say factory type uses that actually have been converted to housing. And really nice one right onto the bike path with a gate onto the bike path as well. And he's right about the Russ's Donuts, because anybody that went to the Brown School, this was a very widely known fact that this is where you came. And one of the participants that's here today, I know, is shaking his head yes, because he benefited from this. But yes, this is why you went to the Brown School, I suspect.
Can I also add, Mark, you alluded to the price of the donut being the operative reason why they were best donuts. And that speaks to why I love Somerville, because we've always been a thrifty bunch. And you have Morgan Memorial Goodwill Store, which is the meeting place for all kinds of people on a daily basis. So
Absolutely.
That's one of the characteristics of Somerville that I love, that we're all thrifty people. So.
The other thing about the donuts he doesn't mention is the fact that they were warm when you got them. They were freshly, so you can't beat that. So.
Absolutely. All right, moving on. All right, just real quick, I'll point out a couple things. This building across the street, when my mother was growing up, that was a Dairy Queen. That's where all the fawns and them hang out. When I was growing up, that was Royal White Laundry. This hole in the ground over here, this, up until very recently, was Miss Hazelton's house. It was a 2-family home. She was a very sweet lady. She resisted selling her home for a very long time, but they got to her. And behind here was another building that was an extension of the Royal White Laundry. They also had another building, that building right there, past that blue house. That was another Royal White. They kind of had a little plant going on here. And then the building adjacent to that was a Commerce, was it?
Chamber of Commerce.
And the Chamber of Commerce, which is now, again, all this whole area being developed. But moving on, as we were talking about the industrial decline in Somerville, kind of after we reached our industrial peak after World War II, as people start fleeing the city for the new suburban homes, and the factories are leaving, Somerville begins to go into decline. Now, if you look at a map of Boston back in the early 60s, what you would see is a lot of ethnic enclaves. And you have these very tight-knit ethnic communities. And many of these communities had an organized crime group that controlled the rackets in the town. And there were these very parochial, tribal communities, very insular neighborhoods that you really didn't typically want to go into unless you were from there. In Somerville, we had a group known as the Winter Hill Gang. Charlestown had a group known as the McLaughlin Gang. The North End was controlled by the Angiulo family, who were connected to the Italian Mafia and run out of Providence, Rhode Island, with the Patriarca crime family, who were then connected to the Colombo crime family in New York. You had East Boston, was controlled by Joe the Animal Barboza. South End and Roxbury had Wimpy Bennett. So you had a lot of different neighborhood groups that controlled the rackets. Aside from the Italian Mafia, most of these were kind of just your local guys, small town type of things, very tribal. And you control the rackets in your little neck of the woods, your little area. You controlled the crime. So we had the Winter Hill Gang, which is established by two childhood best friends, James Buddy McLean and Howie Winter. And at the time as well, you had a gang in South Boston known as the Killeen Gang. So all these little neighborhoods had their crime group, and most of it, for the most part, yes. This is in the early '60s. Yeah, you have these little crime groups at very tight-knit ethnic communities, and for the most part, you'll hear a lot of this, which is mostly a myth that the North End was always considered one of the safest neighborhoods in Boston. And you'll hear a lot of old-timers who grew up in this era saying, yes, we had the Winter Hill Gang, but you could leave your doors unlocked. Your grandmother could walk down the street at 2 in the morning. And that's largely because there was crime, but it was controlled. These guys were looked at as controlling crime because you didn't want crime in your neighborhood because that brought the attention of the police. So you can control kind of small-level crime so you could have a more sophisticated operation going on. So at this time, where it's very tribal, and most people kind of respect their turf. This is your neighborhood, this is our neighborhood, and there would be some, it was an uneasy peace for the most part. So much so that the McLaughlin Gang and the Winter Hill Gang were actually hanging out together. And in 1961, I believe it was Labor Day weekend, they were up in Salisbury Beach, having a good time, celebrating, drinking together, until one of the McLaughlin gangs, one of the McLaughlins, no relation by the way, those are the McLaughlins of Charlestown. We're the Somerville McLaughlins. One of the McLaughlins got a little too drunk and he actually groped the wife of one of the Winter Hill Gang members. He was severely beaten, nearly to death, and was dropped off at the front lawn of the hospital. The guys who did it quickly went to Buddy McLean, who was the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, to let them know what they had done. Shortly after, Buddy McLean is visited by the eldest McLaughlin saying, hey, you guys beat up my brother. I want the guys that did it. And Buddy's like, I'm sorry. Your brother was out of line. He got what was coming to him. Let's just bury the hatchet here. No one knew at that time that that incident was going to kick off one of the bloodiest gang wars in American history. And that tit-for-tat killing was going to happen over the next decade where people would just be gunned down in the street. So what happened was the eldest McLaughlin did not take kindly to that. Shortly after, in the middle of the night, Buddy McLean hears his dog barking. Buddy McLean lived on Snow Terrace in Winter Hill off of Jake Street. And he hears a dog barking in the middle of the night. And he comes out and he sees someone under the hood of his car. And he comes out with his pistol and starts shooting shots into the night. And the person runs off. And Buddy looks under the hood of his car and he sees dynamite strapped to the engine. Buddy's aware that his wife was going to drive his young children to school in the morning, and he's incensed. On Halloween in 1961, Buddy and a group of Somerville guys drive into Charlestown City Square around noontime and locate one of the McLaughlins leaving the Morning Glory Cafe in City Square in Charlestown and publicly executes one of the McLaughlins in broad daylight in Charlestown City Square in front of 100 witnesses. But there was a thing known back then as the Code of Silence, which means you didn't cooperate with law enforcement. So no one saw anything. And Buddy McLean is charged with gun possession. And he's not able to be convicted of the murder. Buddy goes to jail, and the war goes on. Now it's time for retaliation and tit-for-tat killing back and forth as people get gunned down in the streets of Somerville and Charlestown and throughout the Boston area. Now at the time, the gang landscape, as I mentioned, was mostly these little camps. But as the gang war spreads, people feel that they have to start taking allegiances and taking sides. And this is going to change the gang landscape in Boston forever. As people take up alliances, are you with the Winter Hill Gang or are you with the McLaughlins? The Italian Mafia largely sits this out. And they're like, oh, this is great, let the Irish kill each other, and then we'll come on and clean up the mess, and we'll take over everything. But it even starts to affect them, so much so that at some point they're like, we got to weigh in. And the Mafia was And it was essentially whoever's side the mafia takes was probably going to win because they had the big guns, they had more teeth than anyone else. Where the Irish had these little small gangs, the mafia was much more, had an organized structure. So while Buddy McLean is serving time for the gun possession charge, he befriends an Italian mafioso, and they start, as the war is waging on, the Italians basically decide this is really bad for business. You know, we're not, with this war going on, the heat, you're bringing too much attention, we got to kind of resolve this. And they sit with Buddy McLean, and they were like, you know what? Buddy was kind of known as the gentleman gangster. He's known as a fierce street fighter, very well respected. There's actually, I'm not kidding about this, go on Spotify, there's an Irish ballad called The Ballad of Buddy McLean. It's an actual song singing about this guy, to this day, is revered in Somerville as an honorable gangster. And he was known as one of the toughest street fighters in the community. So the Italians are like, you know what, Buddy's a reasonable guy. This guy's a businessman. He's a gentleman. These McLaughlins are kind of just known as wild cowboys. They can't be controlled. They're sociopaths. You really can't do business with these guys. So the Italian Mafia throws their weight behind the Winter Hill Gang and for the most part wipes out the remains of the McLaughlins. But not before they would have their revenge, as Buddy McLean is now out of jail, leaving Pal Joey's, which sat at the corner of Marshall and Broadway and Somerville in Winter Hill. He's leaving and he's gunned down by McLaughlin loyalists, the Hughes brothers, and he's shot with a shotgun and killed in front of the vacant Star Market on Winter Hill. But after that, the remainder of the McLaughlins are wiped out, and Somerville, now the Winter Hill Gang, well, all those alliances they made now fall under the umbrella of Winter Hill Gang. So now they've taken over the territories of those who threw their weight behind the Winter Hill Gang and their enemies. So now we control Charlestown, and whatever Charlestown control, we now control. So the Winter Hill Gang now becomes the largest non-mafia gang in the country. And it basically starts controlling crime for up and down the eastern seaboard. In most of New England. And they work in tandem with the Italian Mafia. There's an uneasy peace here, right? One of the myths they have is that there was kind of a war between the Irish and Italians. You see that in the movies. That wasn't really the case here. It was an uneasy peace. It was mostly, this is your territory, this is ours, we help each other out. You know, you kick back some money to us. Now, during this gang war, while the rage is waging on, the war is raging on, a young Whitey Bulger is serving time in Alcatraz for bank robbery. So lucky for Whitey, he was not around during this war. He comes out of Boston, he comes out of jail back to Boston to a changed gang landscape. It's not the same Boston he left. Where he was a member of the Killeen Gang. They were a small town gang. Now all of a sudden, after Buddy gets killed, Howie Winter's in charge. Howie Winter's in charge of the whole Winter Hill Gang. They're big time now. Whitey reading the gang landscape. He's been in Alcatraz. He's studying. He's preparing for his comeback to Boston. He's reading The Art of War and Machiavelli and all these things, preparing. He comes back. He comes back to the community. He rejoins his Killeen Gang. Now, as the war is ending in Charlestown and Somerville, another war is breaking out in South Boston. As a group of young guys coming up, the Mullen Gang starts challenging the authority of the old-time Killeen Gang, and a war breaks out. And they start killing each other in South Boston. Whitey Bulger sees he's probably on the losing end of this war, and this man is a tactician. What he does is he comes to Howie. He says, Howie, just like Buddy went to the Italians, he said, Howie, you're losing money in South Boston with all this killing. What are we going to do? So Howie comes in and he brokers a treaty. He says, I'm going to merge you two guys. The killing's going to stop, and we're all going to make money. So the two gangs, you guys are going to stop fighting. We're all going to make money together. Whitey, you're in charge. You're my guy in South Boston. You work for me. They work for you. Howie Winter had no idea at the time that this was going to be one of the biggest mistakes of his life, which no one knew that Whitey Bulger was an FBI informant. But, this is a big but, informant's not exactly the right word, because Whitey Bulger's FBI handler was his childhood friend, John Connolly. And the information was really not flowing both ways. and that John Connolly basically was giving information to Whitey Bulger on his enemies. And the proof of that is in 1981, an indictment comes down on the Winter Hill Gang for fixing horse races. The whole gang is indicted. Howie Winter and all the boys go away for a long time. Only one man is left off the indictment, known as labeled an unindicted co-conspirator, Whitey Bulger. He's left on the street. He now takes control of the Winter Hill Gang. Howie's away. He's taking a piece off the board. He's now the #1 Irish gangster in Boston, second only to the Italian Mafia. Moves the operation into South Boston. Most people today associate the Winter Hill Gang with South Boston as a result of that. That's our gang. All right? Winter Hill's in Somerville. Look at a map. All right? Tell that to Hollywood. But anyways, but Whitey's not content with being the #1 Irish gangster. He wants to be the #1 gangster, period. Who stands in his way? Jerry Angiulo. He collaborates with the FBI. Guess who gets indicted next? The Italian Mafia. He's removed all his enemies. He's now the #1 gangster in Boston, operating with a license to kill sanctioned by the FBI. They turn a blind eye to his activities for a very long time. An indictment finally comes down on Whitey Bulger in the mid-90s, and he's tipped off and flees for over 16 years, about 16 years. The rest of his gang gets indicted. Now, he's finally apprehended, I think it was 2008, and he finally gets indicted and convicted of multiple murder and racketeering charges. He is then put in jail and beaten to death. On the day he arrived in a federal prison, he was beaten to death by an Italian mafioso from Massachusetts. And this is supposed to be one of the most secure facilities in the country. How they allow that to happen, some people say maybe they didn't want Whitey to talk too much. I don't know. That's speculation. I will add to this as well. Howie Winter is released from jail after doing about a decade time in the early 90s. Shortly thereafter, he's rearrested for trafficking in cocaine. And they say, at this time, Whitey Bulger's gone. Everyone's basically saying, hey, I'll give you whatever you want. They really don't care about you. Actually, John Monterano, one of Whitey's hitman, grew up on, lived his early years on Pearson Ave over here. He then grew up mostly in Milton, but his family actually left Somerville because they didn't want him to be exposed to the criminal element and moved him to Milton. But yeah, I guess he was drawn to it anyways. But a lot of these guys like John Monterano, who admittedly killed dozens of people, if not more, were given very light sentences. So they say, hey Howie, help us out with your boy Whitey. He ratted you out. You're the reason you just did 10 years was because of Whitey Bulger. Give us a little, we don't care about you and your trafficking charges. We want Whitey. And Howie's response is, I wouldn't rat on my worst enemy, and he does another 10 years. He's one of the only people that did not cooperate. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I'm curious, Howie Winter, did he make up his last name?
No, that's just a coincidence, actually. So yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, the Winter Hill Gang is not named after Howie, nor is Howie named after the gang. It's just a coincidence. But by the early 1980s in Somerville, the Winter Hill Gang is largely defunct. Right? They're pretty much gone. The operation moves to South Boston. But what we did start to see is, as we saw a second wave of immigration. Early on, I mentioned we had the Irish, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Greek. In the late 80s and early 90s, we have a different wave of immigration. Haiti's in civil war, El Salvador's in civil war, Brazil's economy's in the tank, and we start seeing a new wave of immigration from people around the world. Now, up until that point, while Somerville had always been an immigrant city and every immigrant group faced their challenges, right? The racial tension started to build. Because now at this point, by the 80s and the early 90s, you really just had mostly ethnic white neighbors who had been here for generations at that time. And very quickly overnight, Somerville gets, what felt like overnight for people, gets a 30% foreign-born population. And youth gangs start forming. The Winter Hill Gang is gone. No one's controlling the small-level crime in the street. Somerville has this reputation as Slummerville. It's known for crime. These youth gangs start forming around racial gangs, racial gangs, mostly in Somerville High School. The most prominent gang at the time was known as the Notre Dame Gang. It was a big thing in the 90s, in late 80s, to adopt kind of sports teams and change the meaning of you wear your hat or your jacket. And the Notre Dame Gang, of course, was the Fighting Irish. But they said the ND stood for N-words die. And, of course, the other ethnic groups started forming their own gangs. And violence broke out to the point there was actually, in 1991, there was a big racial fight in Somerville High School cafeteria. And in that summer, the violence spilled in the street. And there was a period of 13 stabbings in 14 days where the youth went back and forth retaliating on each other. Luckily, that was a short-lived period in the city. I was in grade school at this time. By the time I got to high school, that racial tension had largely subsided. We did not solve racial relations in America, but we did not have, I was the first generation that grew up with kids from all around the world. So we're at the high schools, this was kind of viewed from their perspective as an invasion in their mind, of like, you know, all of a sudden we have these new people that aren't from here, and you know, we have these attitudes of, you know, this being our community. In the grade schools where you grew up with these people, by the time I got to the high school, we did not have that as much racial tension. Not to say it didn't exist. We did, however, have the presence of MS-13, which was a violent El Salvadorian street gang, which was just barely getting it was kind of in its infancy stages. That was a short-lived period as well. And the reason I kind of stop here and tell all this, as we head into this, these next generation of what we started to see youth violence and youth being lost, is here in 2004, we had the new mayor at the time. One of the initiatives he brought back was he wanted to bring back the fireworks at Trump Field. And that was an old Somerville tradition that they used to do the fireworks. I was about 18 at this time, and me and my friend said, oh boy, you're gonna bring the whole city together in one place? Because it's a wild time. We had a lot of different groups, and a lot of backstory here, but right here on this corner in 2004, there was a triple stabbing. There was a fight that broke out, and a young man, childhood friend of mine, Ryan Sullivan, 16 years old, was killed. That rocked the community. And for me, became a catalyst after a long line of young people being lost to the street, became a catalyst of change, that we need to do something to address this. So we'll talk more as we walk about the neighborhood activism, because as we were seeing, and I'll talk more about this later, this was also at the time of rapid gentrification, and I'll elaborate on that more. But that really rocked the community and spawned a lot of positive things as we all started getting involved in activism.
It's a sad story, but I also just want to put in perspective that it was in the 90s under the Michael Capuano's administration that a lot of these racial tensions broke out, and so there was a big effort to try and get other people to recognize these other groups and these new ethnic groups that were coming in. And so the Human Services Director, for those that might have been around, Ralph Hergert, was very instrumental in actually working with the community in the schools as well in order to had buttons in all the different languages saying that, you know, let's embrace these new people coming in. And then when Joe Curtatone came in the early 2000s that he just referenced, there was a continuation of that. And so there's just a historical perspective.
Yeah. And today Somerville actually, we speak over 50 different languages in this community, so it's a very, very diverse community.
In the high school.
In the high school, yeah. All right, I'll move on to our next stop. So I just want to add one thing I forgot to mention. at the last stop when I was kind of talking about the youth violence. Now, in that the Winter Hill Gang, while it was gone mostly and defunct in Somerville by the 80s, it was the legacy that was left behind. And do we have any sociologists in the crowd? So there's a social theory that's called labeling. It's called labeling, and it means the identity that people prescribe to you, you sometimes adopt. And when for decades Somerville was known as Slummerville, we had this reputation for crime. When I was growing up, we heard these stories. I didn't grow up with the Winter Hill Gang. They were long gone. But I grew up with those stories, and we thought they were pretty cool. And we looked up to that. And we always heard how Somerville was a tough city, and we thought we got to be tough. And that's where I personally believe the community as a whole was labeled, and young people were labeled. And we grew up with this idea of some level, not everybody, of criminality, of being tough. And I think that, at least in part, due to, in combinations with obviously economic forces, might have been why so many people, so many young people got pulled into that life of crime. But anyways, I stop here really briefly just to mention so we can get the visualization of some of the things I was talking about in Somerville's industrial past. This complex here used to be a big paper factory. And of course, as I mentioned, when I was growing up, it was an abandoned paper factory, which you can see an image of down here. And you see the bike trail down here. This is where the train tracks ran. So it's very hard to imagine, and sometimes I don't believe it myself, of Somerville's past, because it's changed so much. When you walk down this beautiful green bike path and you see these beautiful new developments, to imagine walking down an abandoned train track with these massive monoliths of an industrial past. And we have all these broken windows and graffiti, which I may or may not have been responsible for some of those. Because this was our playground. This was our playground. We came down and played in these abandoned factories, and even though my mother told me not to. And I said, you know, this is where people would hang out. So this is just to kind of add a visual component so you can imagine, and to prove that I'm not lying, that this existed for, when did they tear this down, Brandon?
Early 2000s,
Yeah.
I want to say.
Yeah, it was up when I was in high school.
Yeah, and this is actually a very memorable site to those of us that are kind of in planning and preservation, because it epitomizes a lot of what we were saying before about the factory did get torn down here and such, but this is one of the first comprehensive developments that we had in the city called Maxwell's Green. And actually there was more than just the paper factory here. There was a lot of other manufacturing uses here as well. And so the developers worked very closely with the neighborhood that rallied around here in order to make sure that it actually fit in with the surrounding area. Has a lot of green open space obviously here. It's right off the bike path. It takes advantage of that, which, as I mentioned before, wasn't always the case. And also that we now start, when we do tear buildings down, the Somerville Historic Preservation Commission, to which I was staff for many years, has made it so the developers have to show some semblance of what was here before and have a marking about the historical landmark that it represents. So that's what this is an example of here that Mark has brought us to. And so you will see others of these throughout the city. We do try and encourage people to reuse the older buildings, as I mentioned before, but when that can't be done, that's what happens. There was also a charter school was first started here, the first charter school in the city of Somerville, which was controversial at the time. Actually, it was in one of these older buildings and has since disappeared as well.
Yeah, and just a little note that, you know, this was a major employer for this community. In fact, the unit I grew up in, when my grandmother bought the house, she rented to the O'Connell family, and he worked here. This is where he came to work, and it was just over there. And, you know, he would just walk to his factory job. You know, I grew up just around the corner. So just to visualize, and I'll talk more about some of the stuff at the next stop. So again, just very briefly, I just like to point some things out just so you can visualize, as we saw the kind of the picture of that old factory. Of course, we have Maxwell Green over here. That was a big, huge old factory. This is now a assisted living home. This used to be an old mattress factory. across the street, that housing, I don't know what the factory was. I do remember it was an abandoned factory when I was growing up. You can see over here the Rogers Foam, which is now still in use in part Rogers Foam, part Artis housing. And then of course we have the Lowell Street Bridge here. Now we have the Green Line stop, which, you know, that's a whole, that's a tour unto itself. But when I was growing up, I'm sure those who lived here, when they shut down the Lowell and the Cedar Street Bridge for about a decade. And yeah, so when I was a kid, this was this abandoned bridge for the most part, and surrounded by, on all sides, by abandoned factories. So again, just visualizing, as you can see, you know, how different it was. I'm gonna move, I'm gonna stop talking for a bit as we walk up the hill. It's kind of a steep hill. We're gonna be going to Kelly Park. I'll just talk briefly about one of the positive things that we had when I was growing up. We're gonna start talking about the playgrounds, the parks, and how the playground shaped your neighborhood identity. And in Somerville, when I was a kid, we didn't really, it wasn't what gang are you with, it was what park are you from. And that's how I always test some people if they're really from Somerville. I say, what park are you from? And that really started around the recreation program. We had a very robust recreation program in the city. And in the summertime, they would have park leaders. They would hire, it was a great program where they'd hire local teenagers. And it was great for working parents because in the summertime you could send your kid to the playground to be supervised by an older teenager. So it was a jobs program. It's kind of a daycare program. They had a free lunch that would come by. And then at the end of the summer, they had the track meet. And this track meet had gone on for so many years. It was an institution in the city. And you competed, and it was essentially the Somerville Olympics. And you ran and competed for your park. So that kind of became this idea of almost like your sports team, right? And you competed. There was Trump Field versus Kelly Park versus Lincoln Park versus all the different playgrounds in the city, and it was a competitive event. As you grow older and you grew out of the recreation program, like so many towns and communities, teenagers are going to hang out someplace, whether it's your mom's basement, whether it's in front of the 7-Eleven. In Somerville was the parks, right? That's where teenagers congregated and hung out. And again, you kept on that moniker of what playground you were from, and that was your neighborhood gang. And I don't mean Bloods and Crips or anything like that. It's just kind of you were associated with what playground you hung out at. That was your turf. And I will say, you know, most of it was, again, like any town in this country, you have people, teenagers hang out. However, we do have, again, as I mentioned, that legacy of crime. Some groups were tougher than others. Okay, there was definitely some kids in some parks that were had a reputation for themselves. I'll note specifically in the early 90s, Glen Park in East Somerville, they called themselves the Glen Park Mafia. And they were specifically known for trafficking in angel dust, which was the drug of the time. So much so that it became known as the Dust Bowl. And there was a lot of, that was a wild group, it was a wild era. But not every park was like that. You know, you had some groups that were mostly just kids and your typical teenagers, and some did kind of more develop into your more gang, typical gang. But I just say all that to preface kind of as we move on to Kelly Park and that legacy and the different eras. So I'm going to stop talking for a bit as we walk up a very steep hill. We're going to go all the way up to Summer Street.
Before we do it, just two quick things about the parks and playgrounds. One of the things that started under the 1980s and certainly in the 90s under Capuano and then under Curtatone is we've been expanding the number of parks and playgrounds in the city. There was very much just the same parks that had been there for many years, and the feeling is that kids needed a place to go to. So we started taking the vacant lots and actually putting in a lot more parks and playgrounds. Also, before we leave here, I just want to point out the Rogers Foam factory that Mark referenced, that you can see the smokestack over there, is rather important because of the fact that it's a good example of industry working alongside of the community itself, and that is Rogers Foam is still in active use. as a factor, but it also is artist studios. Just to be clear, it's not houses for artists, it's studios. And if you were here last weekend where the Somerville Open Studios SOS, that was a building that a lot of people went to because it housed so many different artists in the city. We're losing them, and this is one of our claims to fame, for those of you that are not already aware of that, is the artist community that gives us such the vibrancy, the funkiness, and such that Somerville is now known for, is because of the artists. And so it is a good example of industry, as I said, and the community working together. So we're hoping to keep that preserved over time. And that's still the original building that the Derby desk was actually created there. Okay, bravo for those of you that all made it up that hill. It's downhill from here, as I said. I just also want to remind you that you get compensation for all the walking you've done today. House of Kebab is offering us free appetizers and drinks at the House of Kebab in Ball Square. That's where we're going to end at 12:30. So please hang in there.
Brandon, when you run for president, I'm going to vote. There's going to be so much free food as local president.
So as I mentioned, the parks, right? One of the parks when I was growing up, when I was in high school, the big time park was Kelly Park. This actually used to be a school, the Morris Kelly School, and as Brandon mentioned at last stop, they tried to make more parks. Kelly Park locally was known as KPU, Kelly Park University. A lot of the different playgrounds had their own monikers. Many of us, I don't know why, adopted the university. Perhaps it's because it was a school of hard knocks and this is where you got your education. So if you see over here on the in big white letters on the fence, you see KPU. That stands for Kelly Park University. As I mentioned, the different playgrounds and as we grew older, how some of them became more looking like a gang, if you will. In the early 90s, we had Angel Dust. In the late 90s, early 2000s, there was the pill craze of things like ecstasy and party drugs, which paved the way for the OxyContin era. And this playground, from my childhood, was kind of ground zero for the OxyContin era, which then gave birth to a national opioid crisis. But in this region, Somerville was a kind of ground zero. So, in late 90s, early 2000, a miracle drug is introduced to the American public known as OxyContin. The reason it's a miracle drug is because it's a very powerful painkiller with no addictive qualities. I repeat that. No addictive qualities. That's how it was advertised, that's how it was promoted. Now, if you know anything about street drugs, at the time, in order to get OxyContin, it had a unique street history. Because when we stereotypically, I should say, think of drug use in this country, we think of it starting in the inner city, and it ripples outwards and spreads. OxyContin had the unique start because it actually started in the suburbs. Why? Because it was expensive, very expensive, right? Why? If you know anything about economics, it was scarce. It's hard to get a hold of. You had to have a prescription. So the way it reached the streets was either maybe your mom or dad had a prescription, or you had a crooked doctor giving you a prescription, or maybe you were prescribed it yourself because you had some kind of injury and you decided selling it. But it starts to spread around the suburbs, and kids are doing it because it's a new drug, no addictive qualities. And we have this gateway of ecstasy and these kind of party drugs, and this was just another pill. And like kids everywhere, young people experiment with drugs and alcohol, right? That's not unique to Somerville. As kids are experimenting with the new drugs, well, as I mentioned, Somerville and neighborhoods like it, specifically Charlestown, had a reputation for crime. If anyone's seen The Town, we know Charlestown specifically had a reputation for bank robbery. Now that had fallen out of favor. You don't see bank jobs like that these days. But some people recognize, wait a second, these pills are really good. You know, they're just sitting there in a pharmacy. Pharmacies don't have any security. I can walk in there with a pellet gun and I can rob a pharmacy. So some people started doing that. Started robbing pharmacies. And now you started to see abundance because you could rob a pharmacy, and if you got one bottle of pills at the pharmacy with 1,000 pills in it, the street rule was typically you sold drugs for $1 a milligram. The highest milligram OxyContin was 80 milligrams. So it's $80 a pop, $80 a pill. And if you have an addiction and a multi-pill a day habit, that adds up very quickly. So as the people started robbing the pharmacies, OxyContin flooded the streets. If you look back at old newspaper articles, when I was in high school, pharmacies were getting robbed on a weekly basis. So much so that they started to have signs in their windows, "We do not carry OxyContin. Don't rob us." Because you could just go in, and as the scarcity went from abundance, the price dropped. It became cheaper to buy, more accessible to poorer or low or working class communities. Now you can get an 80 milligram pill for $40, $20. And the addiction started to grow, and no one knew it. So as the pharmacy stopped carrying OxyContin, the supply dried up, and the price went back up. And now we have people addicted who can't get their OxyContin. So two things started happening. You turn to crime to support your habit. You start robbing people and robbing cars and breaking into houses, or you get a more potent high for a cheaper price than heroin. And that is the birth of the OxyContin epidemic. And a lot of kids in Kelly Park here had connections in Charlestown. They had some family members and cousins in Charlestown, and they became involved in the OxyContin trade. And many became addicted, and many lost their lives. I'll bring your attention to a plaque on the wall over here for a young man named Matty O'Brien. Matty O'Brien was the first person I knew when I was in high school to die in 2001 of an OxyContin overdose. He was 17 years old. Matty was not the first. I mean, he was the first, but he would not be the last. And today, Somerville has lost hundreds of young people of my era. We've really lost a generation. As I mentioned earlier, this is happening at the same time. Youth violence. We also had at the same era, we had the youth overdose epidemic. We also had the youth suicide epidemic and many drug-related suicides. This was all happening in early 2000s. When I was in high school, I entered high school in 2000. By 2004, when I was graduating, we had lost over 16 young people to drug overdose, drug-related suicides and violence. And it would not stop there. So as I mentioned, Matty would be the first person I knew. There's many in between, and then Ryan was kind of the last one that I knew that we were like, enough's enough. And as I grew out of high school and became an adult, a young adult, very young adult, we started to realize this was also coinciding with gentrification. And these issues aren't being talked about. And it felt at the time that nobody wanted to talk about it. Because you started seeing newspaper articles in the Boston Globe, Slummerville no more. Somerville leaves behind its rough and tumble past. But we were still living that. We were still living it. So we started to get involved in trying to raise red flags, say, what's happening here? And one of the things we did was getting involved in community activism. I'll talk more about that at our last stop. But we wanted to preserve our history. We want to get involved in the project, the various construction and redevelopment of the city, and the parks were such a point of contention, right? And I'll talk more about that. But we wanted to do community mural projects as a symbol of our community. So this was our second community mural project that we participated in. And there's a lot of hidden messages in here. And I'll break them down for you. One, of course, we have remembering the young people we've lost. We have this kind of anonymous person here by candle to show how important the playgrounds were to the neighborhood identity. One of the sad traditions we had developed that when a young person passed away, before the wake, before the funeral, all the young people would gather in the playground where that person grew up, and we'd have a candlelit vigil. In all the different, almost neighboring tribes of all the other parks, you'd set aside old grudges and you'd come pay tribute. So we have this symbolizing that. You'll also notice in the windows of these 2- and 3-family houses, we have hockey numbers. These are all young people that hung out at Kelly Park who passed away. This is Brian Liberatore. This is Nikki Peters. This is Dave Martini. This is Matty O'Brien. You'll see this young man is wearing a villain hoodie. Villain became kind of the label of the movement. Villain spelled V-I-L-E-N, as in we're from the Ville, right? That became a popular moniker and a call of unity for Somerville-born residents, because it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek throwback to our reputation of being the bad guys. But we wanted to say, we're proud to be from here, we're proud of this community. And also, quick side note, although I usually call this, my sweater says Townie Tours. There's a local fun fact, because I know we grew up with tough students calling us Townies. In Boston, when we talk about Townies, it specifically means Charlestown. The Charlestown Townies, that's the name of their high school football team. They're the Charlestown Townies. We consider ourselves Somervillans. It's a play on words of Somervillian and the way we talk very quickly, and villain, and also kind of embracing that reputation of saying, oh, we're from the bad days, but we're not ashamed of that, and we're proud of that. You know, there's this young man, and these guys kind of wearing the typical Somerville garb, looking like me, kind of. This guy's got KPU on his hoodie. And we have the shoes on the wire. I'll talk more about that later, but we just kind of wanted to pay tribute to our old Somerville, and we started doing these mural projects and get involved in the community. I'll talk more about that at our last stop. Number 7 was Nicky Peters. Nicky Peters served in the military, and he went overseas. In many ways, he joined the military, as so many of my childhood friends did, to get out of something, to give themselves more opportunity. However, Nicky was not killed overseas. He was actually killed in a street fight when he came home to the States. But because of his military status, the city gave him a plaque or to remember him. And when they asked his parents where they wanted to put the platform, they said Kelly Park, because that's just indicative of how important. This is where he spent his childhood, so this is where they wanted us to remember him. And I'll just keep it moving. So this is my park. This is Lexington Park. LPU. Though we dropped the U during a period of turmoil with Kelly Park. Not to be mistaken for LPB, which is Lincoln Park Boys, different group. But anyways, we talked about these changes. We talked about the turmoil happening. Of course, when I was growing up, this park looked nothing like this. Actually, if you look in your pamphlet, there's a picture of me with a basketball back when I had a full head of hair. And most of this playground was essentially a vacant lot. We had one singular basketball hoop in that corner and a kind of ragtag play structure over there. And that was pretty much it. Not much else. Other than that, it was just hot top. And it was not much going on here. As Brandon mentioned, mostly under the administration of Michael Capuano, the city started to repair and renovate a lot of playgrounds. So sometime in the late 90s, Lexington Park came up to be renovated. As we can see, we came back to the bike trail. So this was the playground next to the abandoned train tracks. Not a lot going on here. The playground was renovated. There's community meetings. One of the great things about this city is if you are organized enough and you have a loud enough voice, you can really sway the way things go. They will usually have some kind of community forum saying, what does the community want? So that happened. They said, what do we want? How do we want to renovate this park? Now, normally you have these two different communities sharing the same space. Somerville has very precious little open space. Most of the two communities, old and new, live next to each other, mostly ambivalent to one another. But occasionally the communities would clash around open space because there's so little of it. So you have two different types of community now, saying what they want from their open space. You had working class families and children of them saying, we want, my big ask, full court basketball. Full court basketball, because I was a little kid and the teenagers dominated the court. And we were like hyenas waiting for the leftover meat. You couldn't get in on the game. So we wanted full court basketball. The newer residents said, we want green space. You know, we've moved, this is a very dense city, we don't have green space. I don't have a child, I have a dog, I want a dog park. I want a community garden. And the neighborhood started getting, you could feel the tension in the room. And the playground was renovated, and it was mostly built into a tot lot. And this basketball court here that you see was not here. They ended up, compromise was 2 half courts. But it wasn't just what the new residents wanted and the old residents wanted. It's what some of the newer residents expressed that they didn't want. And there was a specific sentiment among some that we don't want these teenagers hanging out here. And one of the arguments was the full basketball court, there's just going to be more of them. And they're out here and they're drinking and they're smoking and they're hanging out, and it's just an eyesore having this big, when I was in high school, there'd be 30 kids out here on a Friday night. And in fact, police officers at that time, when they weren't responding to emergencies, their job was essentially to patrol the playgrounds. And they just went from pack to pack to pack. And we used to have Officer Jim as a community police officer who said, personally, I like you here. I have every kid in the whole community right here. And if someone did something, I know who did it and I know where to find you. So largely it was, for many years, for generations, it was a tolerated culture of kids hanging out in the playground. And teenagers being teenagers, they were doing teenage things. We're not condoning it, but it is what was happening. And you have new residents buying up these houses saying, I just bought this house, or I'm renting very expensive home, paying a lot of rent, and I have a gang of teenagers hanging out at all hours of the day, especially in the summertime. And this created a rift of who the park belonged to. And what wasn't considered when they renovated the playground was the cultural component. That the teenagers, we didn't hang out here because it was the best park in the city, it's because it was ours. It was our identity. This was our playground. Well, I can't go to that. Why don't you go play? People say, go play at that playground down the street. Well, that's their playground. And that's going to cause a problem. So anyways, tension started to come up. And it became this battle of whose neighborhood is this? So, as we mentioned, we had no Barneys in the 80s, and then the 90s, in the early 2000s, mid to early 2000s, a new campaign, which was a bit more menacing, was Kill a Yuppie. And that became spray painted across the city. And a war was kind of waged on behalf of a lot of teenagers. Said, we're going to take back this community. This is our city, and we're being made to feel we're not welcome here. We're being pushed out of the park. The cops are being called on us. This is ours. And in the meantime, so this brought a lot of unwanted tension. The tensions rose from there, and a community meeting was held with the new mayor and the chief of police. It was like, what are we going to do about this gang, this menacing gang? And at this time, I'd grown up a little bit. I was probably early 20s now. Identified with these young kids. I knew them. I was one of them at one time. But I was old enough now to see that it wasn't really about the city favoring one group over another. It was about being empowered to advocate for yourself. And that's something we felt we didn't have. And we were facing an OxyContin epidemic and a youth violence epidemic and a youth suicide epidemic. And we're saying, you're paying an awful lot of attention about the graffiti at the park and the graffiti that says, kill a yuppie, but who's actually dying? What conversation are we having about that? So we started to organize, being young rabble-rousers. And we started to say, we heard wind that there was a community meeting taking place at Lexington Park to address this gang problem. About what are we going to do about these hoodlums taking over this playground? And what we did is we organized all those young kids, because they were our peers. And we said, guys, we understand where you're coming from. You're angry. This is all you have, is your identity. And you feel it's being stripped from you. In many ways it is. But there's a dog park group, there's a bike lanes group, there's a green space group, there's a trees group. Where's the group advocating for working class residents of this city? There wasn't really one, or at least not one loud enough that really understood the issues. So we started to engage, and one of our first initiatives is we showed up at this meeting, and we said, are you talking about us? You're having a meeting, maybe we can be involved. And it was a tense meeting. But we started to get to know each other, and it started this movement. And one of the first things we said is, well, how can we share? The reality is this is not our park and it's not your park, it's the community's park. And how can we make it for everybody? And we started getting involved in playground renovations because we knew that if we organized, we could have a voice. And we started to organize young people who had wanted nothing more than to maybe hurt you or vandalize. And we said, we understand that rage, let's channel that for political will. And one of the first things we said was, they said, well, how can we accommodate? How can we make this for everybody? And we said, we want a full court basketball. That was the first thing. And they said, and the mayor at the time said, you got it. Well, we can do that. And they put up these fences, and we held a basketball tournament. And we showed out with a bunch of kids. And we had every year annual basketball tournaments about unity and having people come together, that we could have hundreds of kids here and there wasn't going to be a problem, there wasn't going to be fights, that we weren't gang members. But one of the other things we did was community mural project, our first one. This is not the original, this is a remodeling because the original fell into disrepair. But we understood that we were fighting the tides of change, and in many ways we could not obviously turn back the hands of time, so we wanted to preserve our legacy. And we were inspired by the murals in Northern Ireland and how they told the community story. So this mural right now, just to go through it really quickly, is very symbolic, just like the one at Kelly Park. We start here in the far left corner with Polaroids. Polaroid photos, because we all know back in the day, this is how we took our photos. And you can see the track meet, the Interpark track meet, as we talked about. You see the triple deckers. If you look closely, you can see shoes on the wire. When I was growing up, these wires here used to sag because there was hundreds of shoes up there. We called it sneaker heaven. And when you went back to school in the beginning of the year, you got your new pair of sneakers, you retired your old sneakers, you threw them up to sneaker heaven. And the wires used to sag. We see why nots, we see homage to Russ's Donuts. This is a flower, a rose, driven by my good friend Alex Foster, who grew up across the street, who passed away from a drug overdose. And in that, we have the purple ribbon for recovery. If you look closely at this tree, you see these young people walking on train tracks and how it transforms into a bike trail. In the center of the tree, you see the letters LP, Lexington Park. As I mentioned, we dropped the U. And actually, if you look over in this corner, I just noticed recently on the cement in this corner over here, I only wrote this, in the cement is LPU. I only saw that the other day. Never knew it was there. And if you look in the branches of the tree, it's kind of hidden, but you see the words villain hidden in the branches. And even more hidden in these roots are initials for young people that hung out and spent time in this playground that has passed away. Let's see. We see, can't see what it is, that's a RD for Richard DuPont. FO for Fritz Oderlin, Ryan Sullivan, Alex Foster, Matt, Tommy Westcott, Matt Christa, Chris Orman, and more. James Slattery. We recognize that, paying homage to all the young people who used to spend their time here. And now today we have Somerville, where we take photos on our phones. And we have our Somerville Pride. We have Halloween represented, because I'm sure many of you know, Lexington Ave is a place to be on Halloween. And then we have a poem written by Jay Souza, who is a great soul, who grew up in that house right there. Jay is a local poet and author, and he has a short poem that he wrote, and Jay used to, when we did these basketball tournaments, Jay would give away all his stuff. He was a great organizer. Jay's the great guy, shout out to Jay. And we started organizing and having community dialogues, basketball tournaments, street hockey tournaments, stickball tournaments. Stickball is a big thing in the city if people don't know about stickball. And we started to get to know each other, and it started feeling like a bit of a community. And that's what the crux of it was, right? That we didn't know each other. But here's the irony, right? Because after that little battle was fought, very sadly, many of those people that we fought so hard to bridge that gap don't live here anymore. They moved on. And that's where some of that resentment came from, was that what we see typically, and this is changing, I believe, the trend in the city is people move here, maybe in college, grad school, they meet their significant other, they have a child, they raise their child here till school age, and then they move back to the suburbs. And in the meantime, while they're here, the resentment comes in where people change the community to image themselves, and then they leave. So you change the face of a place, and then you leave. So we want people to stay, and the reason we give this tour is for people to be invested. I always point out there's a statistic, and again, this is changing, but if you look at Somerville High School, it's roughly 60-70% minority. Somerville as a city is about 60-70% white. So that kind of shows you this idea of people not wanting to invest in the public school system and things like that. This is changing for the better, I believe, and they just built a new high school. But one of the things was, to pay for that new high school, we had to increase taxes to pay for it. And a lot of local residents are saying, I'm paying for a high school I won't be able to send my own children to. So this is why we give this tour, to preserve our history, to pay homage. It's a healing thing for me to remember my community and those that were part of it. I also pay tribute over here. This is a very recent addition. We had a memorial dedicated to Ryan Sullivan and his brother Kevin, who passed away 10 years after Ryan. So we pay tribute to them. That was a long project that we had paid in the works. So anyways, I'll wrap it up with that. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I do accept tips if you enjoyed your tour. Also, I have a small business Townie Tours. If you enjoyed the tour, you can go on TripAdvisor, look for the Townie Tours, and leave me a review if you did enjoy the tour. If you didn't, please keep your comments to yourself. And we'll be going to the House of Kebab as well, and I'll join you if anyone wants to have questions. I'll recommend, too, checking out, there's a documentary called Run-In, which I am featured in. It's about the opioid epidemic, specifically in Somerville. You can find that online. And I think that's it.
It's hardly it. I'm so delighted that you all have stayed as long as you have here, and to thank Mark for all he's done. I hired him, just FYI, last year to do this tour because I felt, as having worked for the city for over 4 decades as a city planner, it was very important for people that are new to the city to understand from whence it's come. And even though this is not quite the same history as when we're back in the 19th century, it's a very important part of city of Somerville's evolution in time. And so I think Mark does a wonderful job of sort of tracing it from the 1980s onward. So I hope you'll come to the House of Kebab to continue the discussion. I also want to remind you maybe that May is Preservation Month in the city of Somerville, something that I started a number of years ago. Many communities just did it for one weekend, and I said that's crazy. Somerville has so much more to celebrate and highlight. Let's do it for the whole month of May. So that's why we have a lot of events. There's a flyer here. You can do the QR code, see the other things that are happening this month, and there are several. I also want to let you know that this is my last tour with the city of Somerville. I've been with the city, as I said, for 44 years now, and I'm fully retiring. I semi-retired 2 years ago.
Congratulations. She picked the best one.
As of the end of June. As of last night, I am now a grandmother, my first one. So that was the impetus to do it. So I'm so thrilled to see all of you here today. The reason I had them come back this year is because it didn't get videotaped last year because of some foul-up. And so thank you, Lenny, to the City of Somerville as a videographer. This will be online so that if you have friends that missed it or some that didn't stay the whole length, you can watch it on there. And again, thank you so much for all being here today. And again, remembering we're trying to preserve those aspects of Somerville that are really still important, that give this community the roots and the history and the heritage that's made it what it is today. It wasn't always like this, and we just want people to know that we need to celebrate and recognize those people, the working class, the artisans, the blue-collar people that made this community what it is today. It was, and the irony is, as Mark has said, and he hasn't shared this, but his whole family has been really involved, all the way up to the grandmother and his mother, Charlene, who's still here today, in helping to not only to bridge that gap between the old timers, that we would call you, the natives, and those that are the newcomers here. And the irony is that so many of those old timers can no longer afford to live here unless they're living in their family's home and such. And so it's something that the city of Somerville is working really hard under this administration, Mayor Ballantyne, as well as all the 2 prior ones, through the zoning ordinance that we passed, to have inclusionary housing which means affordable housing is part of every new development that happens in this city. We've increased the requirements for affordable housing over the last 15, actually I passed the ordinance in 1990 with under Mayor Capuano, and now it's up to 20%, which is the highest percentage in any community in the metropolitan Boston area. It's still just a drop in the bucket relative to what, as I was saying before, the real estate prices are. So, but that is allowing some people to stay here and to move here at a more affordable rent or home ownership. So we're working on it, and I do hope that people will stay involved, get in touch with their counselors. As I said, Matt McLaughlin is Ward 1, Mark's brother, but for here it's Lance Davis, and so you can go on the website and find out who the others are. But stay involved, and please come back to the House of Kebab, which is very generously donated all of this appetizers and buffet that they have for us up in Ball Square. So thanks again. And if you didn't sign in, please do. Or didn't get a handout. Okay, so thank you for making it to the end of the tour. Just a couple of reminders. This tour today was sponsored by the City of Somerville and the Somerville Museum, which is a wonderful nonprofit that will be taking over the job that I've been doing for many years through a grant from the city, an ARPA grant. And the person that will be doing a lot of the historic events is Grace Byron, who wasn't able to be here today, but she's the person that you should contact for any additional information. And for example, if you didn't already get a flyer today or a handout, this is what you would be asking for, and Grace can make that available to you. I think it'll also be on the Somerville Museum's website, where you'll find this videotape that is being done by the City of Somerville. It'll also be on YouTube, so in another week or so. So if you weren't able to do the whole tour, or you have friends that missed it totally, then I hope that you will go see it there. And it's been wonderful being part of the City of Somerville for all these years, and I hope you'll stay involved. And if you didn't sign up today, there is a mailing list here as well. Last thing, I just want to remind everybody, because it is the 250th anniversary of the City of Somerville, of the nation, and the City of Somerville will be celebrating its part in that, which is the raid on the Powder House on September 1st, and we have a committee called the 250th Committee being led by the Somerville Museum, and we're looking for people to join the committee to help us figure out how to do that celebration beyond the raid on September 1st. So if you're interested in being part of that, contact Grace Byron at the Somerville Museum. Thanks again for being with us today, and enjoy Porch Fest.